She did not arrive, she manifested. She emerged from the heat shimmer of a long, dusty road, encased in a pickup truck that was less a vehicle and more a monument to entropy. Its paint was the ghost of a forgotten blue, flaking away to reveal the patient gray of rust beneath. Its tires were caked in the red clay of 1,000 backroads, a silent sermon on journeys taken far from the polished asphalt of the civilized world. When she stepped out, she seemed to carry that same dust in the lines of her face and the quiet resignation in her posture. Her name was Alara Vance, but the name was a whisper against the roaring certainty of the place she had entered. The NATO Joint Training Facility was a kingdom of precision, of sharp angles and sharper attitudes. It was a place where strength was measured in the crispness of a uniform and the volume of a voice. Alara possessed neither. Her t-shirt was a faded gray canvas, a ghost of a garment. Her backpack was held together by a single strap that was more prayer than fabric, and her hair was pulled back with a severity that suggested a desire to take up as little space as possible in a world that was already too crowded. She looked like a refugee from a forgotten life, a piece of driftwood washed ashore on an island of iron and ambition. The other recruits, young and sculpted and brimming with the glorious arrogance of the untested, saw her and laughed. The sound was sharp. A flock of crows startled into flight, eager to peck at the strange, still thing that had appeared in their territory. "Lost your way to the kitchen, sweetheart?" one of them called out, the words dripping with the casual cruelty of the confident. Brielle Calloway, a woman whose ambition was a palpable force, as sharp and blonde as her immaculate ponytail, observed Alara with the cold appraisal of a biologist studying an inferior specimen. She did not raise her voice. She let it carry, a carefully modulated instrument of disdain. "Look at that," she murmured to her clique of admirers. "They really do have to meet their quotas. She's a walking, talking public relations initiative. The heart of this kingdom, its roaring, angry son, was Captain Harrow. He was a man who seemed to have been carved from the same granite as the surrounding mountains, his voice a weapon designed to find and shatter the smallest fissure of weakness. His eyes, honed by years of separating the wheat from the chaff, swept across the new arrivals and snagged on Alara like a nail on soft wood. He saw an anomaly, a disruption to his perfect, brutal order. He saw a mistake. "You." The word was a gunshot that silenced the yard. "This is a yard for soldiers, not a shelter for strays. Logistics is on the other side of the base. Get out of my sight before you contaminate my recruits." The cadets snickered, the sound a low, ugly rumble of pack approval. They had their leader's permission now. This strange, silent girl was officially designated as prey. Eladas Chazimetis. Her eyes were the color of a storm-clouded sea, deep and unreadable, holding depths he could not begin to fathom. There was no fear in them, no defiance, only a profound and unnerving stillness that seemed to absorb his rage without reflecting it. "I am Cadet Vance, sir," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise, a simple statement of fact that refused to be dismissed. It was a small, unmovable stone in the path of a raging river. Harrow's face tightened. Her calm was an insult to his authority, a quiet rebellion he didn't know how to crush. "Then get in line," he growled, the words a promise of future pain. "And pray you have what it takes to justify the air you're breathing." The mess hall was the next crucible, a theater of social dominance played out with plastic trays and loud voices. Alara took her food to a corner table, creating a small island of silence in an ocean of noise. But silence, in a place like this, is a vacuum, and it begs to be filled with contempt. Jackson Jax Thorne, a cadet whose physique was matched only by the size of his ego, saw her as an affront to his sense of order. He was a prince in this small kingdom of hardened youth, and she was a peasant sullying his court. He led his retinue to her table. He did not simply drop his tray. He slammed it down with a crack that silenced the nearby conversations, a gauntlet thrown. It was a performance, and the entire room was his audience. "I didn't know they were running a charity drive for the homeless," he announced, his voice booming with practiced arrogance. "Hope the food here is up to your standards, sweetheart." His friends roared with appreciative laughter. They were courtiers, eager to please their king. Alara paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and for a fleeting moment, he felt a strange, unwelcome flicker of unease under her placid gaze. It was like being observed by something ancient. "I'm eating," she said, It was not an explanation or a plea. It was a boundary, a wall of quiet dignity, drawn in the simplest possible way. Her refusal to be baited, to show fear or anger, was a greater offense than any insult she could have uttered. It denied him his power. He leaned in, his face a mask of cruel amusement. "You're taking up space," he snarled. With a flick of his finger, he sent a dollop of lumpy mashed potatoes flying through the air. It landed on the front of her shirt with a soft, wet plop, a perfect, deliberate act of defilement. The room erupted. This was the entertainment they had craved. She did not look at him. She did not look at the stain. With the slow, deliberate movements of someone disarming a bomb, she picked up her napkin and wiped away the food. Her hands were perfectly steady. She then took another bite of her meal. In the universe of her focus, in the small, contained world of her table, Jax Thorne and his jeering audience had ceased to exist. He had thrown his best punch and hit nothing but air. The laughter around him faltered, replaced by a confused, frustrated silence. He had won the battle for attention, but he had utterly lost the war for a reaction. The training field, under the punishing eye of the afternoon sun, was where the body was broken to build the soldier. For Jax, it was where he would reassert his dominance and get the reaction he craved. During a long, grueling run designed to push everyone to their breaking point, he paced himself to run alongside Alara. Her breathing was even, her stride steady, but her old shoelaces, frayed and worn, had come undone again. Having trouble keeping it together? Thrift store? He panted. His voice, a venomous whisper meant only for her. He timed his move perfectly. A slight, almost imperceptible shift of his body, a nudge of his shoulder against hers as he stumbled. It was an act of casual, deniable violence. She stumbled, her rhythm broken. Her hands and knees met the cold, wet shock of the mud at the edge of the track. The pack howled with laughter, the sound sharp and triumphant this time. They had finally drawn a physical reaction, a visible sign of weakness. Captain Harrow's rage was immediate and indiscriminate. He saw only the disruption, the flaw in his perfect machine. "Vance, you are a disgrace to this squad. You break formation, you cost everyone." His voice rolled across the field like thunder. She did not argue. She did not explain. She accepted the blame as she had accepted the scorn. She accepted the 5 penalty laps. She ran them as the rest of the squad watched, their faces a mixture of contempt and smug satisfaction. She ran until her lungs burned with the fire of 1,000 suns, and her legs felt like foreign objects, heavy and unresponsive. She finished and collapsed to the dirt, her body trembling with exhaustion. As she knelt there, gasping for air, Brielle Calloway walked past. She paused, looked down at Alara with a smile that was all teeth, and tossed an empty water bottle at her feet. "Don't dehydrate," she said, her voice dripping with mock concern. Alara watched her walk away. Then, her hand closed around the empty bottle. There was a sharp, explosive crack as the plastic crumpled under a pressure that seemed impossible for her slender fingers to generate. She tossed the mangled result into a trash can 20 feet away with a flick of her wrist. A perfect shot. She had still not made a sound, but for the first time, a few of the onlookers felt a sliver of ice slide down their spines. Her silence was beginning to feel less like weakness and more like a terrible, coiled strength. The days bled into one another, each one a fresh slate for the cadets' casual cruelty. Their taunts became a constant buzzing noise in the background of Alara's existence, the drone of insects she had learned to ignore. But they were beginning to realize they were not tormenting a victim. They were testing the limits of a mystery, and the more they pushed, the more the mystery pushed back in unsettling ways. The land navigation exercise was designed to isolate and disorient, to strip away the comfort of the group and force each cadet into a raw confrontation with their own limitations. Dropped in the heart of a dense, primordial forest with only a map and compass, the cadets were forced to rely on their wits. For most, it was a frantic, nerve-wracking ordeal. For Alara, it was a homecoming. She moved through the trees, not as an intruder, but as a part of the forest itself. Her steps silent on the carpet of pine needles, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. Brielle and her followers, including the wiry and sycophantic Cade, found her consulting her map beneath the shade of an ancient oak. They saw an opportunity too perfect to resist, a chance to truly break her in the isolation of the woods. "Playing make-believe in the woods, Vance?" Cade called out, his voice a harsh intrusion into the cathedral-like quiet of the forest. They circled her, their movements predatory, confident in their numbers. Alara folded her map with meticulous care and prepared to move on. Her indifference was a lit match to Brielle's fuse. With a sudden, vicious movement, Brielle snatched the map from her hand. "You want to be a lone wolf?" she sneered, her eyes glittering with malice. "Let's see you survive without your little cheat sheet." She ripped the map in half, then in quarters, and tossed the pieces into the air like bitter confetti. Her group cheered, their voices ugly and loud in the sacred silence. Alara did not react with panic or anger. She simply watched the paper scraps flutter down to the forest floor like dead leaves. Then she looked at Brielle, and her gaze held no hatred, only a calm, analytical pity that was more unnerving than any threat. "I hope you know your way back," she said. Her voice was flat, a simple statement of fact. She then turned and walked away, her pace unhurried, melting into the dappled shadows of the woods. Brielle's laughter faltered. A sudden, cold unease settled over her group as they looked around at the identical, towering trees. For the first time, they felt truly lost. Alara, meanwhile, was reading a different kind of map. She read the language of the lichen growing thickest on the north side of the trees, the subtle slope of the land that hinted at a hidden stream, the direction of the wind as it whispered through the high branches. She was navigating by an ancient, instinctual knowledge that made paper and ink obsolete. She arrived at the designated rendezvous point a full hour before the next closest cadet, so early that the supervising instructor accused her of cheating until he saw her pristine, uncreased spare map, the one she hadn't even needed to use. That night, a small act of rebellion occurred. Cora, a quiet cadet with observant eyes, had watched the bullying with a growing sense of shame. She found Alara cleaning her gear, isolated as always. Furtively, looking over her shoulder to ensure she wasn't seen by Brielle's sentinels, she pressed a tightly folded object into Alara's hand. "It's a high-protein energy bar," Cora whispered, her eyes darting nervously. "You missed dinner because of Harrow's extra drills, I saw." Alara looked from the bar to Cora's face. For the first time, the mask of impenetrable calm softened. A flicker of something akin to warmth entered her eyes. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a small gesture, but it was a bridge, a fragile connection in a world of hostility. The next day, in the sterile, oil-scented atmosphere of the armory, the foundations of their certainty began to crack. The rifle disassembly drill was a test of muscle memory and cool-headedness. The room was filled with the sounds of fumbling, of muttered curses, of metal scraping against metal. Jax, with his characteristic bravado, muscled his way through it in 1 minute and 43 seconds, a time that earned him nods of approval. Then it was Alara's turn. A hush fell as she approached the bench. Her hands moved with a preternatural grace, a silent conversation between woman and machine. It wasn't speed born of practice. It was an intimacy born of 1,000 secret hours. The M4 carbine seemed to disassemble itself under her touch, its components laid out on the mat in a pattern of perfect geometric order. The reassembly was a mirror image, a river flowing back to its source. She snapped the final piece in place and stepped back. The silence in the room was absolute. Sergeant Polk, a man whose face was a permanent mask of gruff disapproval, stared at the digital timer. He blinked, then blinked again. 52 seconds, he breathed, the words laced with a holy disbelief. He looked at Alara, his eyes narrowed, searching. This was not the work of a cadet. This was the work of a ghost. "Vance," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Tell me again where you learned to do that." Alara's gaze remained fixed on the floor. "I practiced, Sergeant," she repeated, her voice a quiet, unyielding wall. From across the room, Jack scoffed, his voice loud and brittle. "Big deal, so she can clean a gun. That won't save her in a real fight." But his words were hollow. The seed of a terrible doubt had been planted in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. They had seen a glimpse of the truth behind the faded t-shirt and the scuffed boots. And it was something that did not belong in their world. It was something to be feared. The hand-to-hand combat simulation was meant to be a culmination, a public execution. When the pairing was announced, Thorne versus Vance, a predatory thrill rippled through the cadets. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. Here, in the dusty, sun-baked circle of the training yard, there would be no room for quiet tricks or mysterious skills. It would be a simple, brutal equation of size and strength against weakness and fear. Jax stepped into the ring like a gladiator entering the Colosseum. His face was a mask of smug certainty. He saw this not as a match, but as a coronation of his dominance. He would finally shatter her infuriating composure, break her silence, and expose her for the fraud she was. He looked at her small frame, her placid expression, and saw only an easy victory. "Ready to cry, Vance?" he growled, cracking his knuckles for effect. "There's no running now." The instructor raised his hand to signal the start, but Jax was a creature of impulse and ego. He would not wait for permission. He launched himself forward before the signal was given, a pure, undisciplined explosion of aggression. He didn't aim for a takedown or a submission hold. He aimed for humiliation. He grabbed the collar of her shirt with two meaty fists and with a roar of triumph, slammed her backward against the unforgiving concrete wall of the armory. The impact was a sickening thud that echoed across the yard, followed by the violent, grating sound of fabric tearing. Her old, worn t-shirt, unable to withstand the assault, ripped from her shoulder down to the middle of her back. A wave of cruel, triumphant laughter swept through the watching cadets. "Finally showing us what you've got, Vance." Brielle's voice cut through the noise, dripping with venom. The laughter died. It did not fade. It was snuffed out, strangled in their throats by a sudden collective intake of breath. The air became thick, heavy, and silent. The torn shirt had fallen away, exposing the skin of her back, and on that skin, sprawling across her left scapula, was a mark. It was not a casual piece of ink. It was a sigil, faded with time but still radiating a palpable menace. It was an intricate, terrifying design, a coiled black serpent, its scales rendered in painstaking shadowed detail, its fangs sunk deep into a shattered human skull. Colonel Sterling, who had been observing the training with a detached, professional air, went rigid. It was as if he had been struck by lightning. The color drained from his face, leaving behind the waxy pallor of a man who has seen a ghost. He took one step forward, then another, his movements stiff and automatic. The entire training yard, from the lowest cadet to the highest-ranking instructor, was frozen, their attention shifting from the confrontation to the colonel's inexplicable reaction. He stopped directly in front of Alara, his eyes, wide with a mixture of awe and profound disbelief, fixed on the tattoo. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a choked, trembling whisper that was more powerful than any shout. "By what right," he asked, the words tearing from his throat, "do you bear that mark?" Alara stood, her posture unbroken, her breathing as steady as a sleeping child's. The afternoon sun beat down on her exposed back, illuminating the stark, black lines of the sigil. She did not bother to cover it. She looked directly into the colonel's eyes. "I did not ask for it, sir," she said, her voice quiet but carrying with an unnatural clarity in the dead silence. "It was bestowed by the Wraith himself. I was his student for 6 years." The Wraith. The name was not a name. It was a myth, a ghost story whispered in the most secret and secure corridors of global intelligence. It was the call sign of a phantom, the leader of a Black Ops unit so clandestine it had been officially erased from existence. A man who trained only a handful of apprentices in his lifetime, each one a living weapon, each one marked upon their graduation from his impossible crucible. A tremor went through Colonel Sterling's body. His years of military discipline, the rigid control that defined him, took over. His spine snapped ramrod straight. His hand flew to his forehead in a salute so crisp, so perfect, so filled with a lifetime of reverence. It was an act of worship. It was a salute one gives not to a subordinate, but to a legend. The other instructors, their faces slack-jawed with shock, mechanically followed his lead. The entire command staff of the facility was saluting a disheveled, unknown cadet with a torn shirt. The universe of the training camp had just been fundamentally and irrevocably broken and remade. Jax Thorne stumbled backward, his face a mask of utter, uncomprehending terror. The girl he had been tormenting, the object of his scorn, had just been revealed as something holy, something from a world of shadows and violence he couldn't even imagine. He was a schoolyard bully who had just tried to mug a god. An aide standing near the colonel whispered in a choked, horrified voice, his words audible in the crushing silence, "Sir, intelligence chatter always said." No one bears that tattoo unless they were his final student, the one who was with him at the end. Brielle Calloway's smug, cruel world collapsed into dust around her. Her face crumpled, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she stared at the mark that had rewritten reality. The fable had become flesh, and it was terrifying. The colonel's salute was not an action, it was a detonation. It shattered the brittle social hierarchy of the camp, and from the dust, a new order arose. In that single, electrifying moment, Ilara Vance was transformed from a pariah into a totem, a figure of profound and terrifying significance. The atmosphere of the camp became charged with a new kind of electricity, fear, respect, and a desperate, clawing curiosity. Jax Thorne was gone by morning. He did not pack his bags or say his goodbyes. He was simply erased, a ghost in reverse, a man who had been present one moment and utterly absent the next. His departure was not a reassignment. It was an exorcism, a quiet, efficient removal of a sacrilegious stain. The whispers that followed spoke of a desk job in a subarctic monitoring station, a career Siberia from which there would be no return. The morning formation was a somber affair. Captain Harrow, his face pale and his usual booming voice reduced to a strained baritone, addressed the assembled cadets. His eyes carefully avoided Ilara's, as if looking at her directly might cause him to turn to stone. "Effective immediately," he announced, the words feeling heavy and strange in his mouth. Cadet Vance will serve as an advisory instructor for specialized modules in tactical awareness and close-quarters engagement. You will listen to her, you will learn from her, you will afford her the respect her skills command. Dismissed. Her first session was a masterclass in silent instruction. She stood before the cadets, the same faded t-shirt now looking less like a sign of poverty and more like the humble robe of a warrior monk. She didn't speak, she moved. She demonstrated a disarm, a takedown, a subtle shift in balance that could turn an attacker's strength into their own undoing. Her movements were an elegant, lethal poetry, each one stripped of any extraneous effort. She would beckon a cadet forward, correct their stance with a light touch on the shoulder, adjust their grip with her fingertips. Her silence was more instructive than any lecture. The cadets, once her tormentors, now watched her with the desperate attention of students at the feet of a master. They scribbled notes furiously, trying to deconstruct the magic they were witnessing. They were beginning to understand that the skills they were learning were merely the surface. What she truly possessed was a state of being, a centeredness, and a focus that was the true source of her power. Her authority was not confined to the physical. During a high-level strategy briefing for an upcoming field exercise, a visiting major outlined a complex defensive plan on a large digital map. Ilara, sitting silently in the back as an observer, made a few small notes in a worn pocketbook. The major, a proud and competent officer, noticed the quiet scratching of her pen. "Cadet Vance," she said, her tone a mix of genuine curiosity and a hint of challenge. "Do you have something to add?" Ilara stood. She didn't walk to the front. She seemed to simply arrive there, her presence filling the room. "Ma'am," she began, her voice calm and even. "Your plan is solid, but it is based on the assumption that the opposing force will behave conventionally. It has a single, critical vulnerability." She took the digital stylus. With a few swift, precise lines, she highlighted a seemingly insignificant patch of dense woodland and a shallow ravine. A small, disciplined unit, no more than 4 operators, could use this ravine for a covered approach. They would bypass your primary listening posts here and here. They would not attack your flank. They would attack your command and control element directly. By the time your main force realizes what has happened, their leadership will be decapitated, and your entire defensive structure will collapse into chaos. She then drew a new set of lines. "However, if you reposition a single fire team here, in this dead ground, and task them with observation only, you turn their infiltration route into a kill box. You let them walk into the trap. You don't just stop their attack, you annihilate it." The room was silent. The other officers, including the major, stared at the map. It was so simple, so obvious now that she had pointed it out. It was the kind of insight that came not from reading textbooks, but from living in the world of shadows and asymmetrical warfare. The major looked at Ilara, her expression one of pure, unadulterated respect. "Thank you, cadet," she said. "Your point is well taken." Power had not been given to her. They had simply, finally, opened their eyes and recognized it had been there all along. Brielle and the others now moved around her as if she were a celestial body with its own gravitational pull, afraid to be drawn in too close, afraid to be burned by her silent, judging light. Their world, once so certain and simple, had been fractured, and Alara Vance stood at the epicenter of the quake. A week later, a new kind of visitor arrived at the camp. There was no fanfare, no official announcement, but a subtle shift in the base's energy, a tightening of security, a nervous tension in the air that signaled the presence of significant power. A young lieutenant, his face pale and his uniform so crisp it seemed to crackle, approached Alara during a break in training. He came to a halt, a respectful 10 feet away from her, as if crossing an invisible line would be a fatal error. "Ma'am," he stammered, clutching a clipboard so tightly his knuckles were white. "There is a visitor for you at the main gate. He is asking for you by name." A flicker of something unreadable passed through Alara's eyes. She nodded once and followed the lieutenant, her boots making no sound on the asphalt. A small crowd of cadets watched from a distance, their curiosity a palpable force. Waiting at the entrance was a man. He wore no uniform, just a simple, well-tailored black jacket and dark jeans, but he radiated an aura of command that no uniform could ever bestow. He was tall, his presence immense, his face a stoic mask that seemed to conceal a universe of strategic thought and hard-won victories. The armed guards at the gate, elite soldiers themselves, stood straighter, their postures a mixture of discipline and awe. Colonel Sterling was there too, standing not as a commander, but as a respectful subordinate. "General," the colonel said, his voice imbued with a deference that bordered on reverence. The general's eyes, the color of forged steel, did not acknowledge the colonel. They saw only Alara as she approached. As she drew closer, the granite lines of his face softened, just for a moment, revealing a depth of emotion he kept hidden from the rest of the world. A shared history, a silent understanding, passed between them in that single glance. She stopped a few feet away from him, her own face, for the first time, betraying a hint of a softer emotion. "You didn't need to come," she said softly, the words, a gentle admonishment. "I did," he answered, his voice a low, resonant hum of authority and affection. Sensing the need for clarification, for the final, world-altering piece of the puzzle to be put into place, Colonel Sterling turned to the stunned officers and the gawking cadets who had gathered at a safe distance. His voice was imbued with the gravity of a historical announcement. "This," he announced, "is General Kalen Croft." The name landed with the force of an artillery shell. General Croft was a living legend, the architect of a dozen critical victories, a man whose name was spoken with awe in the Pentagon and with fear by the nation's enemies. The colonel paused, letting the weight of the name sink in. Then, he delivered the final, devastating blow to every preconception they had ever held. "He is here for his wife." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with an audible snap in the minds of everyone present. The quiet girl in the worn-out shirt, the protégé of the deadliest assassin, the wife of one of the most powerful men in the military. It was not a contradiction, it was a tapestry, a story of such depth and complexity they could not hope to understand it. General Croft placed a hand on Alara's shoulder, a simple gesture of possession, partnership, and protection. Together, they walked to the beat-up blue pickup truck, the vehicle that had been the first and most enduring symbol of her supposed weakness. Now, it looked like the chariot of a queen who had no need for gold or armor. The engine roared to life, a rough, powerful sound that now seemed fitting, a growl of defiance against a world of superficial judgments. They drove away, kicking up a cloud of dust that obscured their departure. No one moved until the truck was a speck on the horizon. The dilapidated vehicle had become a legend, a symbol of a woman who had no need for the trappings of power because she, herself, was power. The consequences of Alara's brief, seismic passage through the camp arrived not like a storm, but like a quiet, cleansing tide that rearranged the landscape forever. A video of Brielle Calloway's initial mockery of Alara, filmed by a cadet with a phone and a burgeoning sense of justice, surfaced on the military's internal networks. It was not Alara who leaked it. It was the truth, finding its own way to the light. Within 48 hours, Brielle's lucrative sponsorship from a major defense contractor was terminated. A week later, her head held low, she packed her bags and left the camp, her promising career over before it had even begun, a victim of her own casual cruelty. Jax Thorne's dishonorable discharge became a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones across the armed forces, a lesson on the mortal danger of hubris. The others, the ones who had laughed, who had tripped her, who had thrown empty bottles, faced no formal punishment. But they carried something heavier, a corrosive shame, the kind that lingers in the quiet hours of the night and makes you avoid your own reflection in the mirror. They had been weighed in the balance and found wanting, not by Alara, but by their own character. Alara Vance's name remained on the instructor roster, a permanent, ghostly presence, but she never returned to teach another session. Her work was done. Some said she was with General Croft, running a clandestine training program for Tier 1 operators in some undisclosed location. Others said she had vanished, just like her mentor, the Wraith, fading back into the shadows where she belonged. But her story remained. It became a legend at the training facility, a modern fable passed down from one class of recruits to the next. It was not a story about a super soldier. It was a lesson about perception, a warning against the arrogance of assumption, a testament to the power of silence. They learned, through whispers and fragmented files, that Colonel Sterling would occasionally misplace, that she had been chosen by the Wraith not for her strength, but for her stillness, not for her aggression, but for her capacity to listen when others talked. He had seen in the quiet, wealthy orphan a core of unbendable steel, an immunity to the distractions of ego and pride. The tattoo was not a badge of honor to be displayed, but a promise she had made to him and to herself, to be more than anyone ever expected and to never need their approval. She had not come to the camp to prove herself to them. She had come on a private pilgrimage, a test of her own spirit. She had come to prove to herself that she could walk through their world of noise and judgment and remain untouched, her core of silence and strength intact. In the end, it was never about the fight. It was about the unshakable presence of Alara Vance. It was about the way she carried her past, her pain, and her power, all without uttering a single word of complaint or boast. She did not need to raise her voice. She simply waited, with the infinite patience of the truly strong, for the world to learn how to listen. Her legend became a quiet promise, a whisper on the wind that swept through the training yard, a final, enduring lesson for all who would come after. True strength doesn't need to shout. It simply needs to endure. Hold your ground. You are enough.